is then how much we have brought that understanding of the various topics and scriptures into experience. So realization is internalizing these ideas to come to directly experience these ideas. So that is the Dharma of realization. And we'll come back to that very shortly. So here it says that, in order to have a doorway for entering into the Dharma and a central pillar for Mahayana. So we can talk about door of entry into a number of things here. And the first door of entry is here. It says, in order to have a doorway for entering into the Dharma. So what is the door for entering into the Dharma, into the Buddha's teachings? The doorway for entering into the Buddha's teachings is what's called refuge. And refuge here is to go for refuge to what's called the three jewels. Three jewels are Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So the analogy for this, often we see, is the analogy of having some sort of illness or sickness. That generally if we feel we're sick or ill, who or what do we turn to for refuge? Normally we turn to the doctor for refuge because we believe the doctor is qualified, that they can hopefully diagnose what our problem is and then help cure us of our sickness. So we usually turn to the doctor for help. But of course, and so the Buddha is like the doctor, is that we can turn to refuge for the Buddha because the Buddha is qualified. The Buddha is someone who has overcome all of their mental afflictions and suffering. So they're highly qualified in able to help us to do likewise. But just as we go to the doctor, and the doctor maybe diagnose what our problem is, then how they really help us is they usually give us some medicine. And then so the medicine is like the Dharma. The Buddha can't wave a magic wand and cure us, but they can give us medicine. They can give us teachings. They can give us the tools so that we can overcome our own suffering. So therefore, the Dharma is like the medicine. The scripture is like the actual medicine in our hand. But of course, if we can have the best medicine in the world in our hand, if we don't swallow it, it doesn't help. Likewise, we can study lots and have a very good understanding of all Buddhist ideas, but if we don't swallow it, it's not going to help. We can be the smartest Buddhist scholar in the world and be completely miserable. It's like being sick and having the medicine in our hands and not taking the medicine. So therefore, taking the medicine is like meditating on this and realizing these things. To experience them is like swallowing the medicine. So the actual refuge for us is this. Just like when we're sick, the actual refuge, what's actually going to help us overcome suffering, is not the doctor, but taking the medicine. So similarly, the Buddha can't wave a magic wand and help us overcome suffering. We can study a lot and have a very good understanding of these ideas, but unless we internalize them, they're not really going to help us. So that's what Dharma realization. So that's the actual refuge, is how much we've internalized this. And then Sangha is a little bit like the idea of a nurse, that if we're having an operation and we need to recover in the hospital, they help us to recover, they support us. So similarly, the Sangha, the spiritual community, are those around us who help support us in this path. So the door of entry into the Dharma is when we cultivate this refuge, when we have faith and confidence that the Buddha is qualified, the teachings are going to really help us, and then the people who are implementing the teachings also are going to help us. When we have that faith and confidence in those, then we can say we've entered into the Dharma. Just like if we're sick, we've entered into the process of curing ourselves when we have faith and confidence in the doctor and the medicine and so forth. Because if we don't have faith and confidence in the doctor and medicine, we're not going to go to them and we're just going to stay sick. So this is the door of entry into the Dharma. Then we can talk about door of entry into what's called the Theravada. So the Theravada Buddhist traditions, remember, are striving for the goal of nirvana, for our own liberation from suffering. So of course, if we want to do that, we have to develop the wish to be free of suffering, the aspiration for nirvana. And that is usually translated in English as the word renunciation. This is a classic case of how terminology can create a lot of confusion. Because very often, various Sanskrit terms have very specific meanings, but the English language, often there's no word that has that meaning. So the translator's forced to pick a word that sort of approximates it, but often that word in English has other meanings in normal way we speak. So then we get a lot of confusion. And on top of that, this is a case of where the person who originally translated it didn't do a very good job translating. But it's sort of stuck, so it's commonly seen now. The original word in Sanskrit here is nisarana. Ni means out, out or away from. And sarana means to move. So nisarana is the wish to move out of, away from suffering, to the goal of nirvana. That's what it means. So it's really the aspiration for liberation. Whereas renunciation doesn't have that meaning. Renunciation more has the idea of giving up. And what we're talking about here is really giving up the idea that genuine happiness is going to be found out there. So really what renunciation is talking about is giving up craving and attachment to our pleasurable experiences. Because now we hope that our pleasurable experiences are going to satisfy us and last, and we try and hold on to them. But of course, that never works, and we just get frustrated and disappointed and agitated. So therefore, renunciation is about understanding that genuine happiness is nowhere to be found out there, it's within ourselves. But really what this word is talking about is this: it's the wish for nirvana, the wish to be liberated from suffering. So that's of course the door of entry into Theravada. Once we have that wish, then we can move towards the goal of nirvana. And then we can talk about the door of entry into Mahayana. So remember, the Mahayana Buddhist traditions have the final goal, enlightenment. So then to enter the path to enlightenment, we need to have the wish for enlightenment, the aspiration for enlightenment, and that is bodhicitta. Bodhi is Sanskrit for enlightenment, chitta is Sanskrit for mind. So bodhicitta is literally the mind of enlightenment. It's the mind which aspires to enlightenment to help others. So that's the door of entry in the Mahayana to the path to enlightenment. Then we can talk about door of entry the door of entry into Vajrayana or Tantra. The door of entry into Tantra or Vajrayana is empowerment, is that we receive an empowerment from a qualified teacher. They introduce us into a specific tantric practice that empowers us to practice on the path to enlightenment in Tantra. And of course, we're going to look at that shortly in the text, this Vajrayana or Tantra. So this is the door of entry in the various levels of practice in Buddhism. First, refuge, renunciation, bodhicitta, empowerment. So we can see that these build on top of each other. First, we need refuge. On the basis of refuge, we can develop renunciation. On the basis of that, we can develop bodhicitta. On the basis of that, we can have empowerment. So each one builds on the previous. Any questions about that? Anything there? Yeah.
Was I mistaken to think that the doorway to Vajrayana was on top of renunciation, bodhicitta, also wisdom?
Remember, this is door of entry. Door of entry, but again, what we can see here is that to really have a good door of entry, we're assuming we have these already. Right? And to really have this, also we need, so generally it's said, and we'll talk about this later in the Vajrayana section, to be able to have a good basis for this, we need three things. We need this. Well, I mean, this is of course assumed. But we need this, and we need what's called the wisdom of emptiness, the topic here. We need those three things as a foundation, the basis for empowerment. Okay. So it says here that in order to have a doorway for entering into the Dharma and a central pillar for the Mahayana, so not only, and it says sincerely go for refuge, so refuge is the door of entry into the Dharma, and generate bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is the door of entry into the Mahayana. But it says here that bodhicitta is also the central pillar for the Mahayana. So it's the door of entry, but it supports our entire practice. That all practices we do in the Mahayana is on the basis of bodhicitta. That's the central support for our practice. So it says then, sincerely go for your refuge and generate bodhicitta, without these being merely words from your mouth. So therefore, of course, Mahamudra is within the Mahayana tradition. So if we want to practice Mahamudra, we need to have the door of entry, the bodhicitta. And of course, that's based on renunciation and based on refuge. So if we want to enter into the Mahayana to practice Mahamudra, we need refuge and bodhicitta. And of course, implicit in bodhicitta is renunciation. So we need these as the door of entry and support for practice. But it says to do that without these being merely words from your mouth. So if we go to the very last handout at the back, we have this prayers for meditation. And what we often find is in the Mahayana tradition, certainly in the Tibetan Buddhism, whenever we enter into any sort of meditation practice, because it's a Mahayana practice, we do exactly this. We go for refuge and generate bodhicitta, because that's the door of entry and the support for our practice. So to develop that at the beginning of the meditation, we do that. We do the go for refuge and sincerely, as the Panchen Lama suggests, to sincerely go for refuge and generate bodhicitta, because that's the door of entry and support for our practice. So that's the beginning. So we often find at the beginning of any meditation practice, the very first thing we do is in the second paragraph here, is go for refuge and generate bodhicitta. And usually that's here in a form like this. We have a 4-line verse which says, I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So the first two lines is the refuge. The second 2 lines is bodhicitta. And we usually do that 3 times. But of course, what often happens is we have that at the beginning of our practice, and we go, I go for refuge until my Buddha Dharma Sangha. I go for refuge. Oh, finished. Okay, what now? Tick, done that. What do I do now? And we just recite that very quickly without even thinking about it. Because it says, you know, that's where we start, so we do. But we sort of, usually our mind goes into autopilot and just some sounds are coming out of our mouth. Because we don't really want to do this. We want to meditate, so that this is, you know, okay, I have to do it, so I'll do it. And that's what Panchen Lama said we shouldn't do. He said, don't do that being merely words from your mouth, because it doesn't help. So therefore, what we see in this handout, and you commonly see, particularly in the Kagyu tradition, is to avoid this just being merely words from your mouth. Preceding that is 4 other things we're to reflect on. Here are the 4 thoughts. And these are what's called the 4 common preliminaries. And generally in the Kagyu tradition, these preliminaries are called the 4 thoughts. And these are the 4 common preliminaries. Preliminaries foundation. Common meaning in common to all practices. Whatever system of practice you're following, Mahayana, Theravada, these are the foundation of our practice. And so we see here 4 things that we are to reflect on. The first is, this precious life of leisure and opportunity is rare and easily lost. So the first point to reflect on is precious human life. And again, when we look at this practice and it's described, we go, yeah, that's obvious. I know I've got a human life. I know I've got lots of opportunities. And okay, yeah, good, tick. What's next? Because, you know, those preliminaries, that's just sort of for beginners, you know, and I'm a little bit more than a beginner, so give me the advanced stuff. You know, that's that beginner stuff. We'll leave that behind. You know, I know that. You know, I know I've got a precious human life. We don't. Intellectually, when we see this, we think, yes, 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 but experientially, we're nowhere near that. We don't appreciate our human life. In fact, we only tend to We tend to take our life for granted, and we don't ever really appreciate something until we've lost it or are about to lose it. And usually that's what happens. It's only much later in our life, when we're approaching death or we have some serious illness, do we then appreciate this precious human life we have. Not just a human, but we're living in a time and place where we have a lot of opportunities to investigate these things. We have time and leisure. We have cognitive ability, we have some aspiration, but we don't appreciate that until much later in life. And then, of course, we're full of regrets at having wasted our life. So this reflection here is to really experientially see that we've got not just a human life, but we've got a human life full of opportunities, and to appreciate that and not take it for granted. And the second reflection here goes together with this. It says, the world and those within it are impermanent. I too will die soon. And again, intellectually, when we look at that statement, you go, yeah, that's obvious, you know, things change and I'm going to die. Yeah, sure, so what? Again, we're not bringing it inside. We just have some intellectual acceptance of that. The measure of how much we've really done this reflection and internalized is how much do we really appreciate our life, and how much energy do we put in meaningful activities in our life, and how much of our life do we just simply waste, and how lazy are we when it comes to meditating and developing ourselves. If we find ourselves very lazy when it comes to meditation and developing ourselves as a person, we haven't reflected on these 2 points enough. Because if you reflect on these 2 points until they touch you, then I think you'll find you're not going to be lazy when it comes to meditating and doing meaningful things in your life. In fact, what you're going to find is that now, of course, we tend to fill up our life with lots of things. Busy. We're very busy. And actually, recently I heard a thing that, I think this is true, is that in Chinese, in Mandarin, the word busy is made up of 2 characters. The first one means heart, the second one means death. Basically, we're killing our heart. Busy. That's the Mandarin word for being busy. And that's what we do. We fill up our life with lots of stuff. Of course, some of it's essential. Most of us need to work. Some of us have got family responsibilities. And maybe some other responsibilities. But above and beyond these essential activities, we fill up our day with lots of things. And usually for 2 reasons. One is, in our modern society, it's often said, if you're not doing something, you're not being productive. So just do something. Do anything. Do something. And of course, if we're not doing something, we're sitting quietly. It sort of forces us to look at the state of our mind, which is a mess. So we don't like what we see, so we just distract ourselves. So therefore, I think what you'll find is if you really reflect on these 2 ideas and internalise them, you're just going to lose interest in a lot of these extra things that don't bring you anything. In fact, recently, I saw a post on the internet where this lady who had a terminal illness, she posted and she was pleading with people not to waste their life in meaningless activities. Because now she's got a terminal illness, she really understands this. And she appreciates this. So she was pleading with people, please don't waste your life in meaningless activities. Because she's, of course, it's a terminal illness that has come to this realisation. We don't need to be terminally ill to have this. We just reflect on this. We can see the preciousness of our life is not going to last forever. Let's make it meaningful. Let's make it useful. And so then, if we can do those 2 reflections, I think you'll find that you're not going to have this excuse, I'd like to meditate, but I'm just too busy. That's a sign that we haven't reflected on these 2 things. Yes, we're very busy, but what are our priorities in life? And generally, if we don't do this reflection, again, we don't appreciate the precious opportunity we have. It's only much later in life when we're approaching death do we appreciate it, and then we start to have a lot of regrets. And there was it's very well known on the internet, an Australian nurse who was working in the hospice movement, who was caring for terminally ill people over 20, 30 years, and she would ask them about their biggest regrets in life, and she sort of put together a list of the top 5 regrets that she heard over those 20, 30 years. And one of the top regrets was working too hard. Working too hard. Wasting our life on the treadmill of a work existence and not spending more time with family and other meaningful activities. So we can avoid that by doing these reflections. Okay, there's 2 more to go, but I see it's time for a morning tea break. So let's take a morning tea break for half an hour, come back at 11:15, and then we'll finish this and move on to the text and maybe some questions.